All right, folks, I'm finally ready. Sorry about the delay. Technology. Uh, all right, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the end of the 10th week together. First time together since the break. I hope everybody had a decent break. I hope you guys managed to get a little fun in there, but also a lot of work. Hopefully you got ahead. Hopefully you prepared yourselves for what's to come. We have about 6 weeks left, roughly. A lot of stuff's going to start to rain down on you as far as assignments, exams, etc. So ideally, you have sat down, you have mapped it all out for yourself. You know exactly what's coming up. You know exactly how much time you're going to devote to everything, and that's going to make it all very manageable for you. If you haven't done that yet, it's not over yet. You still have time to do it. But make sure you get on top of that, because you know what happens at the end of the semester. It just all falls on you at once. And you can fall prey to it, and you can be backed into a corner that will result in a bad outcome. You don't want a bad outcome. I don't want a bad outcome. I want you guys to do well. I want you guys to feel good about what you've done here so that you can walk into the summer feeling really good about the entire semester. Enjoy that time versus be riddled with regret and be upset by the fact that you could have done better but just chose not to. And then, have sort of a clear mind and be able to kind of look forward and decide what you want to do next. So make sure that you make that happen for yourselves. Make sure that that outcome happens. Make sure that all this works out for you. Because if you don't do that, if it doesn't work out for you, then why are you here to begin with, right? Really, why? Make this work out for yourselves. All right, so we've gotten to the pseudo end of the second part of the course. We still have another chapter we're going to cover next week. So we still have a little bit of time before the second exam, but the second exam will happen, I believe it's a week from Tuesday. So it's coming. So hopefully you spend enough time during the break to at least get caught up on the stuff we've already covered. And that'll allow you to kind of just, learn the few things that we are going to learn between now and the next exam, and then kill the exam, of course. So that hasn't happened yet. If you haven't yet gotten to that point where that's going to be the end result of this second part of the course, make sure that it does happen. Make sure that the next week and a half is spent, really kind of getting in tune with the ideas, with the models, with the math, all of it, so that you can walk away, at least from the second part of the course, with a strong footing that's going to get you into a strong finish for the class. Also, I hope that you spend a good amount of time working on mini papers, etc. Ideally, by now, most of you have knocked out the paper. I don't know. I don't look at who submits what until the end, but if you haven't already, the time will come soon where you will not have many opportunities left. So I suggest you take care of it sooner rather than later. The break was an excellent opportunity for you to do that. I hope you did do that. So make sure that that's being taken care of too, so that you can, at the very least, have a strong showing on that part of the course, which is a relatively easy part of the course if you think about everything else you're expected to do. Are there any questions about anything you want me to talk about before I move forward with the material? All right, great. So we started talking last time about perfect competition, the market setting that we consider to be the most competitive possible over the spectrum of possible marketplaces that an industry can exist in, ranging from perfectly competitive to monopoly, in which is only one firm dominating the market. In order to figure out how prices are set in these markets, we need models to be able to figure out how firms make decisions in these markets. The decisions that we consider in economics are always based on costs and benefits. If we're talking about decisions to do something or not to do something, then you consider overall costs and overall benefits. If you are considering a decision of how much of something to do, then we do marginal analysis. We look at marginal benefit versus marginal cost. We took that approach with the consumer when we looked at the decision to consume using the rational consumer choice model. They got an extra benefit per dollar spent in utility by consuming one thing versus something else. So there was always a trade-off because, again, there were prices and a certain amount of income limiting people's ability to buy things. So that was that side of the market. Now we're on the other side of the market, the supply side. And that decision, the decision to supply is a little bit more complicated because the decisions are made in different contexts. So again, this is the most competitive context. Then we're going to look at monopoly, the least competitive context in the next chapter. But in order to do that, we needed a framework to understand what are the costs that are being considered versus the benefits. So we looked at production and costs in the first few chapters of the second part of the course that established the model that is the basis for all understanding of how firms make decisions in these varying market contexts that then lead to price setting and other sorts of implications for the firms, including output decisions and profits, and ultimately imply something about efficiency of these markets, how overall they work for society, if at all. So all these issues are considered in these models. So, in order for us to understand the one we're looking at here, you need to truly understand like the stuff we've already covered. And obviously in this class, it's about escalating your understanding of these things. So a lot of what we've covered already, was already covered for you in microeconomics. So that's where the math comes in. That's why I've expected you to be able to up your game with respect to your math, your ability to do the math in relation to the models so that you can really truly solidify your understanding of the logic of these models. Because again, the simple cases that we consider in this class are not the actual cases in practice, because practice is more complicated. More complicated situations require more complicated tools. Math is that complicated tool that helps us to maneuver this complicated world that we all live in. So we've looked at production costs. We've built up a framework for that. We've done a bunch of problems to kind of solidify your understanding of the different applications, the different connections between production and cost. And now we started to apply the framework to the first market setting, which was perfect competition. So we'll finish that one today. We looked at the short-run condition for profit maximization, which we'll continue to do today, which again involves a situation where the firm has at least one input into production fixed, and therefore they're limited in how much they can produce by simply being able to adjust their variable input, which we assume is labor. And so that is going to result in certain cost conditions, which they'll compare against the benefits of selling, the revenues they can sell, to get them to their optimal point of supply, which again will be the result that we'll see that will be characteristic of this end of the competitive spectrum, the perfectly competitive market. And then we'll look at the long-run competitive industry supply. Once all inputs are variable, what kind of implications that has for these market outcomes. And that will be it for the day, and that'll be it for this chapter, and then we'll move on to the next chapter next week, which will be monopoly. All right, so previously we talked about perfect competition. There's 4 conditions for perfect competition. Everybody sells the same thing. They sell a standardized product. Firms are price takers. They just accept the price that's being set in the market. The overall market, there's a bunch of sellers, a bunch of buyers. There's a demand curve. There's a supply curve. They meet in the middle. They establish an equilibrium price and quantity. The individual firm has a perspective on that market. And the perspective on that market basically results in them having a perfectly elastic demand curve at the price that's being set in the market. They have a flat demand curve. They cannot change the price that the market has set. They are price takers. They can only sell as much as they want, given the price that's being charged. So how they decide what to sell in these type of markets is to compare it against their costs. There's free entry and exit with perfectly mobile factors of production in the long run. So in the long run, firms can enter or exit these markets, which is what makes them perfectly competitive. Any firm that sees profits in these industries will want to enter these industries and sell, and will have the ability to do so. They can get all the productive resources they need, the labor, the capital, whatever. It's really easily accessible. Nobody cannot get these things, or else it would be a barrier to entry. Fortunately, that's not the case in these markets. There is free entry and exit. And firms and consumers have perfect information. All the information everyone needs to operate as efficiently as possible within the context of a perfectly competitive market is available to everybody. There's no uncertainty about anything. There's no uncertainty about product quality. There's no uncertainty about prices being charged, about the effects that maybe individual suppliers and buyers have on the market. Everybody's very clear. Everybody has to just take the market for what it is and either take it or leave it ultimately. All right, we talked about the short run condition for profit maximization. Profit maximization involves the firm obviously increasing the amount of revenue as much as possible above the cost of producing at any given level. Because each firm is a price taker and they just accept the price being charged and they cannot charge any other price, then their extra revenue they gain by selling additional units, the marginal revenue, is equal to the price. And so their revenue curve is just a linear function of the quantity. The slope of the revenue curve is marginal revenue, and that is constant. It is equal to price, and therefore you just get a line to represent revenue for a perfectly competitive industry. And here's our cost curve. Again, it's reflecting the stuff we talked about with respect to production, in which there's increasing returns initially, which lowers marginal costs initially, and then eventually decreasing returns to the labor input due to diminishing returns to the labor input. You can say it either way. Leads to marginal cost increasing, which is what happens there. So the furthest distance between revenue and cost is the profit maximizing point. And at that point, it happens to be that the slope of the cost curve, our marginal cost, the derivative of our marginal cost curve, is equal to the slope of our revenue curve, the marginal revenue. So at the profit maximizing point, marginal cost equals marginal revenue. For a perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue equals price. So for a perfectly competitive firm, their output level is set at the point where price equals marginal cost. Again, marginal revenue, the change in total revenue that occurs as a result of a 1 unit change in sales. So again, there is a demand curve, a supply curve for the entire market. It sets an equilibrium price. From the firm's perspective, there is a demand at that price. They cannot sell at any other price, so therefore the demand curve is a horizontal line at that price, and it is also their marginal revenue curve. An alternative way to express the competitive output rule can be depicted with standard average and marginal cost curve. So here's their marginal cost curve, again, decreasing at first due to increasing returns to labor, then becoming more and more. Marginal cost is increasing due to diminishing returns to labor. Here's our average total cost curve, U-shaped once again, being pulled down by the spreading effect of the average fixed cost, eventually diminishing returns. The diminishing returns effect of the average variable cost dominates and starts to pull up average total cost, which happens at the point where marginal cost crosses it. So throwing in the marginal revenue curve, the perfectly elastic demand curve, we can see that the perfectly competitive firm will set their output level at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And then at that point, they can figure out if they're making profits by looking at what the average total cost of producing at that level is. So the difference between what they're charging and their average cost of production is going to represent the profit for that 1 unit. And then you multiply that times the amount they're selling is going to give you the total profit they can earn. So it is profit equals the price times quantity, the revenue minus the cost of producing at any given level. The area of the shaded rectangle is given by Q times the height, which is price minus average total cost. All right, so there could be a situation under which the firm might choose to shut down in the short run. So in the short run, they may be in a situation where the amount that they're earning, the amount that they're charging may actually be less than the average cost of producing at the optimal output level. And so here they are setting their optimal output level at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. But we see that average total cost is above the price at that level. And so that means that the firm is going to be making losses. So this is the revenues they earn, the price times quantity. The average total cost of producing is above that price, which means that the average total cost times the quantity is the total cost of producing. So we see that that amount exceeds revenue. That means they're operating at a loss. So the firm should potentially shut down. Now, the other thing they need to consider is their fixed costs. Are their fixed costs going to be covered by some of their revenues if they continue operating. And if so, then it makes sense for them to continue operating. So here we see that although average total cost is above the price, average variable cost is below the price, and therefore at that optimal output level, the average variable cost, the average amount of producing a unit attributable to the variable input, which is labor, is this amount times the quantity gives us our total variable cost. So we see that revenues are covering all the variable costs. We know the difference between average total cost and average variable cost is average fixed cost. Average fixed cost times quantity is total fixed cost. So this square here represents the fixed cost. If they continue operating, even though they're operating at a loss, they only have to cover this much of their fixed costs. So again, these are the revenues. This is how much their loss would be. If they were to shut down, though, they would have to pay their entire fixed cost because, again, they're in the short run. They have to pay for their fixed costs until they can get out of the business, out of their rental agreements for the equipment, maybe time to sell off the machinery and the buildings they own. Who knows? Whatever it is that their fixed cost is, in the short run, they can't get rid of it, so they would have to at least pay for those fixed costs. So we see for this firm, even though they're making economic losses, it makes sense for them to continue operating in the short run, at least to cover some of those fixed costs. Because again, this is greater than the loss that they would incur if they continued operating. All right, now there's a different scenario. Once again, they said their optimal output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But in this case, average total cost and average variable cost are both above the price. So again, here is the revenue, and we see that there's our average total cost curve, there's our fixed costs, and therefore the difference between this point and this point represents the average variable cost of producing times the quantity gives us the variable cost of producing, the amount that they need to pay in wages. And you can see that revenues are not even covering that. And therefore, because the average variable cost is above the price, that means that some of those wages have to be paid out of pocket by the firm in the short run. And therefore, they would want to shut down in that case. If they shut down, then they only have to incur the fixed costs. So this is a loss if they produce. This is a loss if they shut down. It makes sense for them to shut down. So that is the shutdown condition. If price falls below the minimum of the average variable cost, the firm should shut down in the short run. Quick practice problem. Suppose the cost function for a firm is given by this cost function. What does this $100 represent? Fixed cost. Very good. What is the Q squared? It's the variable cost. If the firm sells output in a perfectly competitive market and other firms in the industry sell output at a price of $10, what level of output should the firm produce to maximize profits or minimize losses? So what is the profit maximizing condition the firm follows to set their profit maximizing output? Something equals something. Price equals marginal cost is correct. I'm sure that was right at the tip of your tongue. So yeah, price equals marginal cost is their profit maximizing condition for the competitive firm. We know marginal cost is the derivative of our cost function with respect to quantity, so that's 2Q there. Price is equal to $10. And so just doing a little bit of algebra there, you solve for the optimal quantity, in this case to be 5 units. Pretty simple stuff there. So now the question is, like, is the price going to be above their average variable cost, right? So what is the variable cost again? In general. What is the average variable cost therefore? Q, right? Q squared divided by Q. All right. So there you go. Q squared divided by Q. That is going to give us our average variable cost. Q is equal to 5. How much is the price? So should the firm continue operating if it's incurring losses? It should, because price is above the average variable cost. All right, average variable cost of 5 is equals 5. Price is 10. 10 is greater than average variable cost. The firm should produce 5 units. Let's look at the profits now. Price times quantity minus the cost of producing the optimal quantity. Price times quantity is our revenue. Price 10, quantity 5, so that's 50, minus the cost of producing 5 units, which is equal to 125. So we see that the firm is making economic losses. But we see that the economic losses are less than how much would they have to pay if they shut down? $100, right? They'd have to pay the fixed costs. They'd have to pay their $100 in fixed costs if they were to shut down. They continue operating because their losses would be negative 100 as opposed to negative 75. All right, so this understanding of the shutdown condition for the firm then allows us to understand what the individual firm's supply curve looks like. Ultimately, what the supply relationship for the individual firm looks like. So over here, there's obviously a supply and demand curve. Things are happening in the market. Things are shifting supply. Things are shifting demand, as we know from our earlier part of the course, as well as our earlier courses that we've taken. So this price is moving up and down, right? We know that if the price falls below the average variable cost, the firm will shut down, but it will supply at any point above that, and the rule that they will follow to decide how much the supply will be, figuring out where the price meets the marginal cost. And therefore, the firm's short-run supply curve is the marginal cost curve for the individual firm, starting from the minimum of the average variable cost curve, which is where the marginal cost crosses it. So that portion of our marginal cost curve above the minimum of the average variable cost curve represents the individual firm's short-run supply curve. The short-run supply curve for a perfectly competitive firm is its marginal cost curve above the minimum point on the average variable cost curve. All right, let's look at the short-run competitive industry supply. So much like with the individual demand curves that we derived from the optimal points of consumption that we looked at with the rational consumer choice model, that we saw change as the prices of the goods change, which got us to different equilibriums on the indifference curve and budget constraint framework. So that got us to individual demand curves, which we were able to aggregate to get to the market demand curve, which is the market demand curve that we are all familiar with when talking about supply and demand. So similarly, we can do the same thing by looking at the individual firms' marginal cost curves above their minimum of their average variable costs, and aggregate across prices to be able to get to the market supply curve. So this is Mr. Silva's supply curve. This is Mr. Liu's supply curve for coffee. And again, this represents our marginal cost above the minimum of the average variable cost. At $2, Silva is willing to supply 3. $2, Liu is willing to supply 2. That means that at $2, the entire market will supply 5 units. Same thing for $1. $1, Silva will supply 2. Liu will supply 1. So the market supply at $1 will be $3. So we do a horizontal summation across prices in order to get to our market supply curve. The horizontal summation of an individual firm supply into industry supply is a simple form when the firms in the industry are identical. Suppose you have n firms that each have inverse supply functions, P equals C plus D times QI. So some constant and some slope D. To derive the industry supply, we first convert the function into a supply function. So again, much like we did when we aggregated our individual consumption into the market demand that we did mathematically in the first part of the course, you do the same thing here for the individual firms to get to the market supply. We need to do a horizontal summation across prices, meaning we're adding quantities. To add quantities, you got to get the inverse supply function into supply function form, which means you need to solve for quantity in terms of price. So here, just doing a little bit of algebra. I subtracted C from both sides. I just switched the sides here and subtracted C from both sides. And that means that our quantity equals 1 over the slope times P minus C over D. The industry supply is the sum of the quantity supplied, QI, by each of the N firms. If the N firms are identical, then basically you just multiply N times the individual firm quantity supplied, which again is their their supply function. And so N times QI will get us this expression, and then you do some math there, distribute that out. And then you can, again, solve for P in terms of Q to get back to that inverse demand function, inverse supply function. So you've got Q times D. So I'll multiply both sides by D there. And then I'm going to subtract, I'm going to add NC to both sides. What else did I do there? I divide both sides by N. And then I added C to both sides. Anyway, so that gets you back to the market inverse supply function, which you can see is basically the market supply function is the individual firm supply function with just the slope divided by N, the number of firms. So the intuition is that each one unit supplied by the industry is 1 divided by N unit for each firm to supply. So the amount that's supplied in the market is divided up by the amount of firms. So that's a shortcut to getting to the market supply curve, is just to divide the slope by the number of firms there. This implies the general rule for constructing the industry supply curve from N identical firms with supply curve, with inverse supply function there. The industry supply curve is, again, just D divided by N there, the number of firms. Quick practice problem. Suppose an industry has 200 firms, each with supply curve P equals 100 plus 1,000 QI. What is the industry supply curve? So obviously we could just divide this by 200 and that'll get us the answer there. Or the other way is to do the actual math, which I did, just to give you a little practice. And I know you guys love it, so that's why I'm giving you this gift of more algebra. All right, so I'm going to, again, solve for Q in terms of P there. Just do a little algebra, subtract 100 from both sides, divide both sides by 1,000. And now I'm just going to multiply this expression by 200. And so that cancels out there. You get P over 5 minus 1 over 20. Or I'm sorry, 20 minus 20 there. And then we're just going to solve for P in terms of Q again. So I added 20 to both sides, multiply both sides by 5. There you go. So we got the same thing that we would have gotten if we just divided 1,000 by 200. Anyway, that's how you get from the individual firms supply to the market supply. So it's important to always be able to understand how the individual behavior of an agent in our models relates to the overall behavior of the entire aggregate. In this case, we're talking about an individual firm as how their behavior relates to the overall supply side of the market. So we need models to be able to explain the behavior of individuals, but ultimately we want to understand the overall behavior of the economy. And so you have to be able to go from the individual to the overall entity. All right, let's talk about the efficiency of the short-run competitive equilibrium. So as I said before, as I've said probably before, is that in competitive markets, the markets result in the best possible outcome for society. So we measure that in welfare, in consumer and producer surplus. And so the consumer and producer surplus for these markets is going to be the most possible. So here's the demand, here's the supply curve. Again, it sets a price of $10. Here's the individual firm's perspective on the market. There's their perfectly elastic demand curve, which is their marginal revenue curve. There's their marginal cost curve. That's the point at which they're going to supply, and we see their average variable cost is below that. One of the most attractive features of competitive markets is the fact that they result in allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency is a condition in which all possible gains from exchange are realized. At the short-run competitive equilibrium price and quantity, the value of the resources used to produce the last unit of output is exactly equal to the value of that unit of output to consumers. So price equals marginal cost. And why that's important here is because that's not going to be the case when we look at monopoly, when we look at any other market setting, which will all vary in their degree of competitiveness, but none will be anywhere near as perfect in their competition as the perfectly competitive markets are. All of them will have some of that efficiency eroded by the fact that there is market power, the ability to price above marginal cost. So in those situations, the value to society of an additional unit, the price will exceed the cost to society of producing those units, the marginal cost, which means that we could do better, but we don't. That's what we call market failure. Failures arise in markets. That's one result. We'll look at that. We'll look at the implications for efficiency, for prices, and profits as we get to those sections. So let's look at the producer surplus. Again, the measure of the welfare of the market. On the side of producers, again, the portion that results in the best allocative result. So to say that a competitive market is efficient is to say that it maximizes the net benefit to its participants. Producer surplus is the dollar amount by which a firm benefits by producing a profit maximizing level of output. In this example, again, they're producing at this point where price equals marginal cost. Their average variable cost is below the price in that case. So producer surplus measures how much better off a firm is as a result of having supplied its profit maximizing level of output. It includes both profit and fixed costs in the short run. In the short run, producer surplus is going to be larger than economic profit, since firms would lose more than its economic profit if it were prevented from participating. If it did not supply at the profit maximizing output price and quantity combination, they would have to pay some of those fixed costs out of pocket, and that would erode some of their profits as well. If they shut down completely, then they would have to pay their fixed costs, and therefore the fact that they are able to operate in these markets in the way they do, part of the benefit is that they don't have to pay their fixed costs. That their fixed costs can be covered by the revenues that they earn in the market. So that is considered part of their producer surplus. In the long run, all costs are variable, so producer surplus is the same as economic profit. To measure the total producer surplus for a market, we add the producer surplus for each firm that participates. In cases where each firm's marginal cost curve is upward sloping for the bulk of its range, aggregate producer surplus is well approximated by the area between the equilibrium price and above the supply curve, which again is the sum of the individual firm's marginal cost curves. The total benefits from exchange in the marketplace may be measured by the sum of the consumer and producer surplus. So this is the total benefits that, again, the marketplace generates for all participants. Again, you've got a bunch of buyers that are willing to pay more than they have to, and you have a bunch of sellers whose additional cost of selling units is less than the price they're charging, and therefore they get to benefit from the market as well. And again, in terms of producers, that takes the form of profits and their fixed costs. All right, now let's look at the long-run competitive industry supply curve. So again, let's say you have a situation where a firm is incurring economic losses. In this particular example, here's the downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. It establishes an equilibrium price, which is, again, the marginal revenue, perfectly elastic demand curve for this perfectly competitive firm. Here's its marginal cost curve. That's where they meet. Therefore, that's the profit maximizing level. At that level, we see that average total cost is above price. Therefore, economic losses are being incurred. But average variable cost is below it. And therefore, some of the revenues are covering some of the wages and are covering all of the wages and some of the fixed costs. It makes sense for the firm to continue operating. But there are losses being made. And so in the long run, what's going to happen over here as far as our demand and supply framework, given what's happening here? Well, they can't really do that, because then they'll be shooting themselves in the foot. But in the long run, when all when all inputs are variable and firms can get out of their contracts, for their capital equipment, etc., what are they going to do? In the long run, they will exit the market, right? They will leave. They will stop. They will get out. They're losing money. They don't want to be in these markets anymore. So what happens over here on this side? Supply curve will shift to the left. The supply curve will shift to the left or up, however you want to describe it. Right. When the supply curve shifts to the left or up, that will bring the equilibrium price up. So the remaining firms will have the price brought up to the point where it is at least tangent to the average total cost curve, and therefore there are no economic losses being made, but ultimately zero economic profit is being made as well. So in the long run, the price will erode all losses to those firms that may remain in the industry, and there will be zero economic profit. Price will equal marginal cost, and it will equal average total cost, the minimum of the average total cost, because that's price equals marginal cost. Marginal cost crosses average total cost at its minimum, and so that's the point at which a perfectly competitive firm will operate. That's also important because it will be different for less competitive markets. They will not be operating at this point. For perfectly competitive markets, at this point, they have basically done the best they can to minimize their cost of producing. They've lowered the cost of production as much as possibly can happen. So the price equals what's called the break-even price. So the minimum of the average total cost is called the break-even price. Now, if the opposite case were to happen where the average total cost is below the price, and therefore there are economic profits being made in the short run, that's going to lure more firms into the industry, and therefore in the long run the supply curve will shift to the right, which will lower the price. So again, if the price is above the average total cost and the price comes down, then once again in the long run it'll come down enough so to the point where it once again will be tangent to that average total cost curve, in which case it will be zero economic profits. So again, if there are profits, firms will enter. If there are losses, firms will exit, ultimately resulting in our long-run competitive equilibrium. In the long run, perfectly competitive firms produce at a level of output such that price equals marginal cost and price equals the minimum of the average cost curve. Again, these firms in these perfectly competitive markets in the long run have exhausted all economies of scale, meaning that they are producing at the lowest cost possible, the lowest average cost of production. And again, it's the most efficient outcome that you can get in a market. All right, let's talk about long-run supply curves with U-shaped long-run average cost curves. So again, in the short run, the supply curve in a perfectly competitive market is the horizontal summation across prices of all the marginal cost curves above each individual firm's average variable cost. The long-run supply curve for a competitive industry is not the horizontal summation of the long-run marginal cost curves of individual firms. As long as the expansion of industry output does not cause the prices of the inputs to rise, meaning the cost of the firm to rise, there will be no long-run increase in the price of a product. So the long-run supply curve for a competitive industry with U-shaped long-run average cost curves and constant input prices is going to be just a horizontal line at the minimum value of the average cost curve. So again, the individual firms are either in the short run going to be operating at a point where they're making losses or profits. So let's say that there's been enough adjustments and we've gone to the long run competitive equilibrium where the price is equal to the minimum of the average cost curve. I don't know, incomes go up, let's say. So let's say we're over here at this initial equilibrium. Incomes go up. At any given level, people are willing to buy more. So the demand curve shifts to the right. The demand curve shifts to the right. That brings up the price. So now the price is above the average cost of producing for all existing producers. There's economic profits to be made. In the long run, more firms are going to enter the industry. So as a result of that, the supply curve will shift to the right enough so that it will bring the price back down to the minimum of the average total cost curve. So in the long run, no matter what, we're always going to get back to that price level, the price that corresponds to the minimum of the average total cost curve, and therefore the supply in the long run in a perfectly competitive market will be perfectly elastic at the price that, again, corresponds to the minimum of the average total cost curve. The break-even price is what it's called. And so this is like where these competitive markets are always heading. They're always heading to this point. Obviously, the long run in econ is always like a theoretical point. It's sort of like the point where like the systems are always trying to get to. They're never quite there, but the tendencies to get there are always there. And obviously there's other things working on those forces. There's, you know, like I mentioned, there's supply and demand moving over here. There's potential things happening with costs. But you know, if you think about these industries and where they're ultimately heading to this point. And so it's always important to kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about like these industries, like what are they doing now, where are they heading, and what are the things that can affect that trajectory. Practice problem. All firms in a competitive industry have the long run total cost curve given by this cubic expression here. What will be the industry's long-run equilibrium price? So remember, the price in the long run for these competitive industries happens at what point? Price equals marginal cost and equals, yes, and what else? Which part of that? The minimum. You're French, right? I understand. J'entends. All right. So we need to figure out the minimum of the average total cost curve. How do we find a minimum of something? How do we find a minimum of a mathematical relationship? Say that one more time. Is that what? Wait, not just that. That's the second step. Take the derivative and then set it to 0, right? So we need to find the minimum of our long run total cost and then set that equal to the set that equal to 0. But not the long run total cost. We need the average long run total cost. So we need to divide this by Q first and then take the minimum of that. So here's our long run total cost curve. Dividing it by Q gets us to the long run average total cost curve. So again, it just divided by Q there. That Q dropped out. One Q dropped out there. One there. Left us with Q squared. Now we take the derivative. So what's the derivative of this term? 2Q. What's this? -7. And this? 0. All right. So there's our derivative. We set it equal to 0. Do a little bit of algebra now. And therefore, the quantity will be equal to 3.5. So how do we get the price then? Plug it into what? Exactly. We have to plug in this quantity into our average total cost. We're looking for the break-even price where average total cost equals price. So the price will equal 3.5 squared minus 7 times 3.5 plus 24. So it equals 1175 there. Questions on that? All right. If the inverse market demand function is equal to P equals 1000 minus 7Q, how many firms will there be in equilibrium? Assume fractional numbers are possible. So this is the market demand curve. And again, there's going to be, in this case, for the entire market, you're going to, again, if you look at that equilibrium price, it's going to give you how much is being supplied in the total market. The amount that we just figured out was for an individual firm. So how are we going to get the number of firms in the industry? So this is what you have to do. You have to put your price, right, into our market demand inverse demand function. That's going to tell us how much quantity is being supplied at the price at the market level. We know how much is being supplied for the individual firm, so we divide the market level amount by the individual firm amount, and that gets us the number of firms in the market. All right, so this is 1,000 minus 7Q. Again, price equals 1175. That means the industry output is 141.18. The individual output for the firm in the long run, remember we figured out what was the quantity that minimized the long run average total cost. We figured out it was 3.5. So that's how much each individual firm supplies. So dividing industry output by individual firm output will get us the number of firms, which is in this case 40.34. Long run versus short run. That's life, folks. All right. What is the marginal cost for producing 3.5 units? $11.75, right? Price equals marginal cost equals the minimum of the average total cost, right? So yes, indeed. So just to verify that, we plug in 3.75 into our marginal cost, which is the derivative of our long run total cost. And that's going to get us to 11.75. What profit does the company make? How do we get that? That's a way of solving it, yes. What does the long run represent, though? Represents the point where the firms are making what kind of profit? Zero economic profit, right? In the long run, there's zero economic profits. If there were profits, firms would enter, supply would shift, price would drop, there'd be no profits. So yes, we could figure it out and we can plug everything in and we would wind up with an answer of 0. Alrighty. Now let's do another big practice problem, throwing in a lot of the stuff we've already covered the last few weeks. Doug wants to go into the donut business. For $500 a month, he can rent a bakery. So his capital is equal to 1, complete with all the equipment he needs to make different kinds of donuts. He has to pay donut bakers a monthly salary of $400 each. So that's their wage. He projects his production function to be equal to this Cobb-Douglas production function. Again, it's Cobb-Douglas because each of our inputs are being multiplied and they're being raised to some exponent between 0 and 1. And there's some constant in front of it. Q is measured in tons of donuts per month. L is the number of bakers, and a ton of donuts sells for $1,500. So we're told that a ton of donuts sells for $1,500. How many bakers will Doug hire to make 10 tons of donuts in the short run? How's he going to figure that out? So in the short run, first of all, the fact that he's in the short run means that his capital is fixed, right? Capital is equal to how much? 1, right? So that would simplify our production function. How are we going to solve for the number of laborers he should hire to produce 10 donuts? Just plug in 10, right? And then just solve for L. So again, Q equals 10. And then we just solve for L there, divide both sides by 2, and then raise both sides, well, square both sides, and then you get to L equals 25. What is Doug's short run cost of producing 10 tons of donuts? All right, short run cost, variable cost, fixed cost. So we should set up our expression, right, for the total cost, which is a function of quantity, right? So there's going to be that extra step where we need to solve for labor in terms of quantity to get our variable cost, which is our wage times our labor. All right, so total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost. Fixed cost equals the rental rate times the amount of capital. The rental rate is $500. That's our capital is equal to 1, plus our wage times our labor. Labor in terms of quantity, right? Because total cost is a function of quantity, not labor. So 1 times 500 is that. 400 times L in terms of Q. So where do we get L in terms of Q? Where can we get our labor in terms of our quantity? Production function. From the production function, that's where we can get it. So we plug in K equals 1 there, and we need to solve for L, which I have several times in this class, so I just skipped a bunch of stuff. If you don't know how to do it, make sure you figure out how to do it. So this is Q over 2 squared. That's our L in terms of quantity. So 400 times this expression will get us our variable cost expression. And so that's Q squared over 4. 400 divided by 4 is 100, so 100 Q squared plus 500 there. So again, we're looking at short run cost of producing 10 tons of donuts. Plugging in 10 for Q will get us our total cost, which is 10,500. All right. If Doug can modify the bakery in the long run, how many workers should he use to produce 10 tons of donuts? So in the long run, everything's variable. So therefore, we're going to have capital and labor variable. That's two variables we need to solve for. When you have two variables you need to solve for, you need two equations that relate the variables to each other. We've got one equation here, our production function. What's the other equation that we can use that relates both labor and capital to each other? Where can we get that other equation? This is a long run situation. I'm trying to minimize costs in the long run. So remember, what was the framework that we used, the model that we used to figure out how to minimize costs in the long run? Bunch of curves interacting. Isoquants, isocost curves. There was a point of tangency where their slopes were equal, and that was the point at which the cost was minimized. The amount of capital and labor minimized the cost of producing a certain amount. What was the slope of the isoquant of? Marginal rate of technical substitution. Exactly. Marginal rate of technical substitution. We set that equal to the ratio of what to what, which is equal to the slope of the isocost line. So that's a way of expressing the marginal rate of technical substitution. We set that equal to the slope of the isocost line, which is equal to the ratio of wage over the rental rate. Exactly. The ratio of the price of the input on the x-axis, which is labor, we assume it to be labor, to the price of the input on the y-axis, which is capital. So at the cost minimizing input mix, the slope of the isoquant is equal to the slope of the isocost. The marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to the negative ratio of the wage to the rental rate. What is the marginal rate of technical substitution composed of? It's also a ratio of a couple of things. Sure. The marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to a ratio of a couple of things. What are those things? Very good. It's the marginal product of labor, the marginal product of capital. Exactly. Slope of the isoquant equals slope of the isocost. Marginal product of labor over the marginal product of capital equals the wage to the rental rate. Marginal product of labor is the partial derivative of our production function with respect to labor, right? So you multiply the whole thing by 1/2, subtract 1 from there, which I did, which gets us to KL raised to the negative 1/2. Marginal product of capital is a derivative of this with respect to capital, so K is raised to the power of 1, multiply the whole thing by 1, subtract 1 from that, which leaves you K raised to the power of 0, which is equal to 1. So you're left with 2L to the 1/2. That is the marginal product of capital. Set that equal to 400 over 500, and now you can reduce this and relate capital to labor, and you'll have your second equation to be able to solve for the optimal quantities of capital and labor in the long run. Again, two equations. are needed to solve for two unknowns. You have two unknowns in the long run, capital and labor. In the short run, you only have one unknown, labor, because you're in the short run. Something's fixed, capital. All right. L raised to the power of negative 1/2 over L raised to the power of 1/2. You're subtracting that, the exponent from the bottom from the top, so that's going to be negative 1. So your L raised to negative 1, that's going to be K over L times 2. Then you multiply, so this is equal to 4/5. Multiply the whole thing by 2, so that's going to get you 8 over 5, and then you're going to have L down here, so I multiply that to the right as well, so that got me to the L over here. So K equals 8/5 L is the optimal ratio of capital to labor. And we've got our second equation, our production function. We just need to plug in Q equals 10 there. And I also plugged in K equals 8/5 L or 1.6 L over here to be able to solve for labor now. So it's just math there. You have L raised to the 3/2. Multiply 2 by 1.6, that's 3.2. Divide both sides by 3.2, it's going to get you to 3.125 equals L raised to the power of 1.5. Raise both sides to the power of 1 divided by 1.5. That's going to get you to the optimal amount of labor to be 2.14 units of labor. So that amount of labor is the amount that he should use to produce 10 tons of donuts in the long run, which is significantly less than he was able to choose in the short run when he was limited by the amount of capital he was using. What's the long run? What is the total long run cost of producing 10 tons of donuts, and how does it compare to the short run cost of producing 10 tons of donuts? All right, so short run, we figured that out already. In the long run, everything's variable. So we don't need an equation. We just need the amount of labor and the amount of capital they can use. We figured out labor, so now we just need to plug that into one of those two equations to get our capital, and then multiply each by their price to get the overall cost of producing in the long run. So long run total cost equals just the amount of capital times the rental rate, the amount of labor times the wage. So we have 2.14 times 400. We need this K here. We can get it from this expression here by plugging in 2.14 L into that, and that's going to get us our optimal amount of capital to be 3.42 units. So in the long run, it makes sense for him to increase the amount of bakeries he uses by 2.42 units in order to minimize his cost of producing. So that's going to be a long run cost of $25.66. The long run cost is much smaller than the short run cost. I forgot what we figured out it was, but it is smaller. How many donuts should Doug produce in the short run? How do we figure that out? How many donuts should Doug produce in the short run? Think about the chapter we just covered. Remember, we did a problem to figure out how many things a certain firm should produce. They follow a certain condition. Perfectly competitive industry. What was that? To figure out their optimal output, they set... Yes, say it. I'm hearing it, but it's very low. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Fortunately, I'm not 80 yet. My hearing is still okay. So yeah, we're going to set price equal to marginal cost. What's the price? $1,500. A ton of donuts sells for $1,500. Not like he can choose whatever price he wants. No, he can't. That's the price that it's going in the market. Therefore, you know it's a perfectly competitive industry. If you're given a price, that means they cannot affect the price. That means that we're talking about a perfectly competitive industry. All right, marginal cost equals price. There's our total cost function. Now we need our marginal cost. Obviously, we're going to take the derivative. So pretty simple there. That's going to equal 200Q. And set that equal to 1,500. Divide both sides by 200. That's going to get us to our optimal quantity of donuts tons that he should supply, which is 7.5 tons. Any questions on that? All right, so as you can see, I'm always like kind of taking us back as we move forward to kind of just put it all together, because ultimately this is all like one huge model. And so you kind of always have to have all the pieces like in mind, even as you advance your understanding, as we did in this chapter of the industry, in this case a perfectly competitive industry. We still have to consider the fact that everything we've talked about this far is relevant here. Like the cost curves that we talked about a few chapters ago are still present here. So all of it is still in play. It's just now we're trying to figure out how much the firm should produce given, you know, their cost conditions and the kind of market that they're operating in. And if they can affect price, and we would talk about that as well. But in this particular type of market, they cannot affect price. They are price takers. So they simply take the price. So it is 1,500 is given to us. What is his maximum monthly profit in the short run? Well, we're just going to do your standard profit, price times quantity minus total cost. Price 1,500, quantity 7.5, and total cost of producing 7.5 units. So again, for this part and the last part, you needed the total cost equation, or you wouldn't be able to solve for it. So it's important to know everything. We've covered a lot, and I expect you to know it all, because again, like I'm not just having you learn one piece and then you know are okay with you just like forgetting that, but kind of knowing this other stuff over here. In a class like this, it's not possible. Like you have to kind of have it all together and all ready to be used in your arsenal to be able to truly understand these results that we're getting. So you do need to solve for a total cost. You need to know what total cost is, how you get that from this information here, and ultimately how to be able to solve for optimal supply and the kind of profits that the firm makes. In this case, they're making 51.25. What does that mean for this industry in the long run? What's going to happen in terms of like the number of firms? They're going to increase, right? Firms are going to enter the industry, and therefore what's going to happen to this in the long run? It's going to go to zero. Very good. All right, just one last quick topic. This is actually not in the chapter, and you've probably already learned it already several times, but I'm just going to quickly go over the elasticity of supply because it's something we haven't covered, and it was covered in another chapter that we didn't cover. I just want to make sure that you're just reminded of what it is. So the price elasticity of supply is the percent change in quantity supply that occurs in response to a 1% change in the product price. So again, it's the change in the quantity supplied over the quantity supplied times 100. And then you have the change in price is the change in price over price times 100. So you've got the elasticity of supply equal to the ratio of those. And so then you have a ratio of this expression to this expression, and the hundreds drop out. And then you have a ratio divided by a ratio, which is the ratio times the reciprocal of the bottom ratio. And that means that the elasticity of supply can be expressed as the slope of the supply function times the price over the quantity. So exactly the same thing mechanically as the price elasticity of supply of the price elasticity of demand that we looked at a few chapters ago. So that's how we can express the price elasticity of supply. So at a point QP on the industry supply curve, where a change in price gives rise to a change in quantity and the quantity supplied, the price elasticity of supply will be, of course, the slope of the demand function. So it's 1 over the slope of this line times the price over the quantity. So there you go. And of course, this is always going to be positive because of the law of supply. As you increase price, quantity supplied goes up, and vice versa. They move in the same direction, so you won't get that negative number we got in the price elasticity of demand. And of course, the supply for a good is considered inelastic if its price elasticity is between 0 and 1 in absolute value. The supply for a good is considered elastic if its price elasticity is greater than 1 in absolute value. And the supply for a good is unit elastic if its price elasticity is equal to 1 in absolute value. All right, folks, we're done with this chapter. Congratulations. One more week to go in the second exam, so take advantage of the weekend. but also try to enjoy it. I'll see you on Tuesday.